In Israel, news about the draft law often features heated debates, with politicians arguing and protests erupting. The discussion is typically framed as a clash between those accused of avoiding service and those who blame them, a debate that has persisted for decades. But that framing completely misses the point. This isn't actually about individual choices. It's about a very deep, century-old dispute over what the public atmosphere of the Jewish state should look like. It's a battle over who gets to define the soul of Israel, and that's why it's so explosive. To properly understand the Haredi refusal to be drafted, you have to realize they believe they are acting on behalf of the entire nation. Since the state's founding, the IDF has been more than a military force. It was conceived as a melting pot to forge the new Jew, modern, Zionist, and largely secular. The Haredi position is rooted in a fundamental theological claim. They believe their intensive, uninterrupted Torah study and public Orthodox atmosphere are the spiritual shields that protect the Jewish people and secures our eternal existence for future generations. A service equal to and perhaps more vital than physical defense for the moment. But this isn't just about the yeshiva walls. When Haredi leaders resist the draft, they're fighting to protect their community's autonomy, which extends beyond military bases and into the public atmosphere of the entire state of Israel. Why? They argue that if they compromise their strict separation, if they send their young men into an environment like the army, where secularization is the norm, where gender separation is not absolute, and where the culture challenges their values, they risk two things. One, the spiritual death of the individual. Their young men leave the community, breaking the chain of tradition. Two, the spiritual death of the collective. If they accept the state's mandate to melt them into a secular model, they fear the entire Jewish character of Israel will erode. They see themselves as the last line of defense against wholesale spiritual assimilation. Therefore, their resistance to the draft is not just about the army. It's a political tool to maintain leverage over the public space in the state. By resisting, they demand that the state and its institutions must remain friendly to a maximalist religious lifestyle. And this is exactly what frightens many in the secular public. The secular public sees Haredi success in resisting the draft as not just draft dodging, but as a victory that empowers them to demand a more religious public space for everyone, a greater restriction of public transportation on Shabbat, less gender mixing in public, and increased funding for religious rather than secular education. The same fear is what causes the high command of the army to prevent the promotion of genuinely religious officers to high ranks, and not to allow a strict Haredi atmosphere in the army until less than a year ago, when the Hashmonaim Brigade was established. So the refusal to enlist is the central leverage point in a much larger struggle, defining what kind of Jewish state Israel will ultimately be. When they resist the draft, they are resisting what they see as the military's decades-long agenda to secularize them. They believe their absence is a fight for the right of public religious atmosphere in the country, the right to have schools, neighborhoods, and institutions governed by traditional religious law without being pressured to conform to modern secular norms. This is the core of the conflict. The Haredi community is saying, we are the spiritual lungs of the nation. And the secular community, perhaps unknowingly, is often saying, your spiritual lungs are creating an environment that we find restrictive or alienating. To be intellectually honest, both sides are suffering from a deficit. The Haredi world, in its focus on spiritual perfection, often lacks the aspiration for physical defense. They're disconnected from the responsibility of sovereignty, of holding the sword to protect the very land that enables their learning. On the other hand, the secular public has often prioritized building the state's physical infrastructure, its high-tech, its army, while losing touch with the foundational Jewish traditions that give the state its meaning. They need to improve their approach to Jewish tradition. This is exactly what Rav Kook foresaw. He understood that this tension was a necessary birth pang. He believed the secular builders and religious scholars were both indispensable and would eventually fill each other's missing parts. But here is the most crucial point. This synthesis, this filling of the deficit, is a process of deep cultural change, not an overnight political fix. You cannot force a spiritual or cultural shift with a 3-year mandatory service decree. A conflict this deep, lasting for generations, cannot be resolved fast. It requires gradual steps, mutual respect, and a willingness for both the army to truly accommodate faith and the Haredim to find a way to contribute physically. If you try to ram through a forced draft, the Haredim will only double down on their refusal and the rift will deepen. The only way forward is through a gradual, step-by-step approach. The goal should be mutual recognition. The secular public must recognize the spiritual contribution of the Haredim, and the Haredim must find a way to share the physical burden of defending the nation. It's about patience, respect, and realizing that to survive, the Jewish state needs both the sword and the book, and it needs them to learn to coexist. Thank you so much for watching.